And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, talking with Dr. Marco Navarro-Genie. He is the president of the Haultain Research Institute. Marco, we were just getting into the guts of the kind of the current relationship between Putin's Russia and Cuba. Please continue with your explanation.
Thank you. It has taken a whole new hue in the sense that Cuba has suddenly become more desirable, or the friendship with Cuba has become more desirable since essentially the invasion of Crimea in 2014. The Russians essentially came to Cuba and forgave about 90% of the debt that Cuba had with the former Soviet Union, some $40 billion, which is a big deal for Cuba, needless to say, in exchange essentially for a kind of tacit support of Cuba's involvement in Crimea.
Russia's involvement, yes.
Russia's, yes, forgive me. That relationship now has deepened somewhat because now Russia finds itself once again a pariah among the community of nations and is reaching out to potential allies, however small. Cuba is a small country, but it punches above its weight when it comes to diplomacy because it's been the head of the non-aligned countries in the world, and lots of people in Latin America especially look to Cuba for sort of international leadership.
So what does that mean in terms of the Russian presence on Cuban soil? Has that increased at all?
It has. There's been an enormous amount of exchanges lately, diplomatic and commercial. Um, we have to underline that this rapprochement is largely commercial.
Okay.
There has been commercial delegations coming to Cuba, hundreds and hundreds of business people from Cuba to invest in Cuba, to invest in essentially the collapsing infrastructure and in foodstuffs. They are opening up or reopening a new steel plant. They're investing in the electrical grid, which had essentially collapsed in Cuba. They're reinvesting monies in the tourist industry and in some resorts. They're mostly also bringing foods, wheat, oil, for example, that Venezuela now is nearly incapable of supplying oil to Cuba. So these are commercial ventures. What is interesting and different, Tony, is that Cuba, in order to attract this investment from Russia, has had to essentially give up large chunks of its sovereignty, which is going to create significant problems inside of Cuba. There's a preferential treatment to this Russian investment. They don't have to pay taxes. They're allowed to repatriate almost all of their profits. And this has required changes in law and in constitution, which eventually will cause significant problems inside the island.
Now, what about China and its presence on the island?
China is also present there, and China has been coming on and off. China's presence in Russia, in in Cuba, is larger than Russia's in many ways. The exception is that neither China or Canada, for that matter, Canada has a large presence, a commercial presence in Cuba. In fact, it's hard to imagine, but here we are making a big deal out of the commercial ties with Russia.
All right.
Canada's presence in Cuba is twice as large as the present investments of Russia into Cuba. So neither Canada nor China have the kind of preferential treatment that Russia is getting, and that is why this Russian thing is such a big deal.
Has there been any reaction from the Biden administration to all of this?
Since Trump, the screws were more than tightened in relation to Cuba, and none of that has been loosened up in any degree. The Biden administration is pretty much sleepwalking through Latin America, and not much has been done. They they remind me a little bit of what is going on in Ottawa today. They issue press releases and decrees, and they say that they don't like what's going on there. But there doesn't seem to be much in the way of activity to try to contain or keep the Russians out. Not that they can keep the Russians out anyway.
Right. True point there. Marco, we're going to take another brief break. Interesting conversation. We'll be back with you after these commercial messages. Please stay with us.